Hi, I'm Lisa Donovan, co-director of Brainworks, the Berkshire Regional Arts Integration Network. Today, the Brainworks team and I are going to share with you a poetry strategy that you can integrate into lessons in your classroom. Among the teachers we work with, this poetry strategy is one of their favorites because it's so adaptable. This strategy is also featured in Shell Education's book series, Integrating the Arts Across the Curriculum. The strategy is called found poetry, a technique where poems are created by taking existing words found in texts and rearranging them to make meaning. As you'll see in just a moment, this poetry strategy prompts students to select words or phrases from a text, play with words, experiment with different pairings, use interesting line breaks, and juxtapose ideas to create fresh language. Poetry can be used in a variety of ways, in an exploration of a dense nonfiction text, a newspaper article, a page from a novel, and so on. Let's take a look at how to implement this strategy in your classroom. And as we go along, watch for evidence of learning in the language arts, history, and social sciences. Start by selecting an existing text you'd like students to work with. Today, we'll work with an advertisement from 1855, featured in the newspaper, the Chicago Democrat. This advertisement encouraged westward expansion by promoting acres of prairie farmland for sale with low interest and long credit. Since students will later be cutting apart the text for the found poetry activity, you'll need to make photocopies. Fair use guidelines for copyrighted materials used for educational purposes allow us to make the copies. Let's imagine this class is learning about westward expansion in social studies. Begin by having students reread the advertisement and clarify the meaning.
The soil is a dark, rich mold, from 1 to 5 feet in depth, is gently rolling, and peculiarly fitted for grazing cattle and sheep, or the cultivation of wheat, corn, etc.
As a class, define found poetry. Introduce the elements of poetry. There are many different ideas about poetry elements in the field. We're drawing from ideas in the Shell Education book series on arts integration. In this series, a distilled set of 5 elements are shared: structure, rhythm, sound, imagery, and density. Structure focuses on how ideas are organized. Some poems are free verse, meaning they don't conform to a consistent pattern, and others follow a specific form like haikus or limericks and cinquains. Intentional line breaks and use of space on the page create meaning. Decide as a class if you'll be using a specific form of poetry for the found poetry strategy. Rhythm is the beat of the poem, which is created through pattern, repetition, syllables, and rhyme. Remind students that not all poems need to rhyme. Sound. Meaning can be created through sound, and this is often achieved through the use of onomatopoeia, assonance, consonants, alliteration, and more. Imagery. Imagery is when word choices and figurative language create an image in the reader's mind by evoking the senses and imagination. Density is what is said or can be said in the space. Density distinguishes poetry from regular speech and prose. Poetry uses language to distill ideas into a compact form of expression. Teach these concepts and practice them with the class before embarking on the lesson. After distributing scissors, glue, and a blank page on which students will create their poem, provide students with ample time to work. This group has been challenged to develop a free-form found poem that explores the reasons why some people wanted to move west in the 19th century. Let's see how each student has developed their found poem.
What can be done? Through the richest and the most fertile prairies, the soil is a dark, rich mold, cultivating newly broken prairie farmlands. By judicious management, farms may be broken and fenced, displacing to deteriorate. Plow the ground very deep. At your request, broke up a field, and the work of cultivation is done. I think I definitely used structure, and I used some of the original text to break up the lines, and really it marks the change that I was trying to do and the shift in theme.
Millions of acres of stolen land, cut down, picked off, and divided. What can be done? Over 2 million scattered. What can be done? I used structure and density to create a prose, very short poem, just to really get into the nitty gritty of what is actually going on.
The farmland economy, the rapid settlement of the country, productiveness of Illinois. Lands are well known. Illinois Central. Richest and most fertile prairies, reasonable rates will enable a man to make himself independent. No ordinary culture. I feel like as an artistic brain, I like to do anything with art. So when I'm presented with something like this, it made me feel more interested in the historical aspect. Because when I initially sat down to look at it, I was a little overwhelmed with looking at it. And then I started to read it and started to see it from an artistic perspective. And it helped me understand the historical aspect as well.
Gently rolling farmlands of rich, flourishing soil. Cattle and sheep grazing. One man is cultivating wheat. Low price. So what I wanted to do for mine is emphasize that they were painting a picture. So I also sort of did that. I thought that the text of the original advertisement sort of looks like the rolling fields. So I wanted to cut out the shapes to match that. Another thing about making found poetry is the use of concrete poetry, which is totally optional for students who might be doing this exercise, but creates the freedom to think about the original text in different ways.
Trees deducted for cash under a growth of flourishing towns repays the cost of very large profits in cut down stumps. Cash is a dark, rich mold, not required to be gently rolling. Yours truly, the richest, J&A Griswold, President. I think I used structure for this because I just really like the way I put the words on here. I think just kind of helps put out my point. I know a lot of us have mentioned using the phrase "what can be done," not as a positive, but as a negative, like what can be done. It's a different way of taking all this stuff that you've learned and just applying it in a non-traditional way, which is always great. Yeah.
Farmland for sale, flourishing towns and villages, twice plowing on perfectly smooth land, grazing cattle and sheep, the cultivation of wheat, no farther greater than these. I feel like a lot of poetry ends up connecting to history. Like in my experience with poetry, I've had a lot of like people reflecting when they're writing poetry instead of more of like a futuristic thing. So I think poetry and history are able to connect really easily. And when I was structuring out my poem, I did it by cutting out lines instead of like individual words. And then I wanted to be able to have it sort of go down into a shape.
Today, we've explored the integration of found poetry and social studies. But there are opportunities to integrate poetry into nearly any content area. Here are a few final ideas to help you use the found poetry strategy successfully in your classroom. Ask students to read their poems aloud to the class. This can give students the opportunity to practice reading with accuracy, fluency, and vocal intonation. Remember, teach the elements of poetry ahead of time. Later, you can use these elements as part of a checklist to assess students' progress in writing the poem. You can also encourage students to use the vocabulary of poetry to discuss their artistic choices and observations. Think about assembling all of the poems in a class book. Students can reread each other's work and compare and contrast poems. Work with a variety of mentor texts, such as The Arrow Finds Its Mark, a book of found poems by Georgia Hurd, or Jen Bogart's The ABCs of Plum Island, Massachusetts. Mentor texts are a great way to provide rich examples. Play around with different forms of poetry. Try dividing the class into groups and assign each group a different form of poetry, such as haiku or cinquain, or acrostic, to name a few. With all students working from the same source text, it can be fascinating to see what similarities and differences the resulting found poems have. One form of poetry that can be especially enjoyable to try in combination with found poetry is concrete poetry. Concrete poetry is when the poem is arranged to create a visual element that supports or illustrates content in the poem. Another way to explore found poetry is to combine it with a word bowl poem. In a word bowl poem, students place their cut-apart images and phrases in a communal bowl, and then students reach back into the bowl and randomly pull out a designated number of paper slips and develop their poem from them. Pick a different kind of source material instead of a written text. For example, start with a photograph or illustration. Have students write or brainstorm what they see in the image and collect ideas. And then have students reread their writing and identify compelling words and phrases or draw from brainstormed lists. Here, students' writing becomes the inspiration for reassembling the words in new ways to create the poem. You'll notice that in arts integration, you don't need to leave the process to assess learning. Assessment is built right into the strategy itself. The planning students engage in as they create their poem provides opportunities for teachers to assess learning throughout the strategy. Debriefing conversations during and at the end of the process allow students a chance to explain their thinking. These discussions can solidify academic concepts for them and help you to evaluate their comprehension of the topics. We hope you'll try found poetry in your classroom. If you liked this video, be sure to check out the other tutorials from brainworks on how to use arts-based strategies in your classroom, including tableau, movement phrases, soundscapes, chants, storytelling, and collagraph printmaking. Visit us on the web at brainworks.mcla.edu. You can also check out the Arts Integration series, Integrating the Arts Across the Curriculum through Shell Education. Thanks for watching.